work I'm going to be presenting today is the work I'm doing for the Climate Research for Development Fellowship, and it's based on work that I've been doing the last 12 years through my graduate and postdoctoral work at Oxford, ETH Zurich, and Colorado State University. So the topic is, of course, synergies and trade-offs of green urban infrastructure for climate adaptation in peri-urban areas, and it feeds well into some of the challenges that Cosmos just discussed. So our challenge is that unprecedented climate change and migration presents a perfect urban storm, and I know we've been discussing this yesterday to a large extent. So the recent, you would have seen the IPCC report, 1.5 report that was published last year, the Climate Change and Land report that was just published last month, and the Cryosphere and Ocean report that was published just this week. And all these reports show that since 1850 in pre-industrial era, we've seen between 0.8 and 1.2 degree average warming across the globe. And this is expected to increase unless we adopt certain scenarios for changes around the 2040s, and it might level out. So we would see this in this area. But of course, there's a range of uncertainty. And we're already seeing the impacts. So this is just some images we've seen and I've taken in the last year in Dar es Salaam. And we're seeing major disruptions of bus rapid transport systems. We're seeing flooding. We're seeing housing collapsing and high levels of flooding in people's homes. We're seeing abandonment and regular flooding happening every year. So these complex systems dynamics are impacting both natural resources, food security in rural origins as people move from their incapability to produce their crops to their destinations. And it's particularly acute in sub-Saharan Africa, and this complex natural and social economic dynamic threatens the irreversible collapse in ecosystem services, diversity and functioning. And just this week, the World Bank has indicated that there's major impetus to raise adaptation finance, but we see that most of this adaptation finance is still being channeled across our continent to rural areas. So another component of our issue that was just discussed is that human population is growing rapidly. So we just see this in very, very rapid increase, especially since the 1970s. We've seen 3.7 to 7.6 people living on this planet. We're also seeing substantive migration internationally and internally. And so this offers many opportunities, such as new remittance streams to facilitate rural transformation, such as infrastructure and education. But of course, we're seeing the deterioration of overstretched infrastructure and services. We're seeing poor working conditions and rising inequality. So how do we reimagine the African urban future? We can see on this graph it's different regions across the world, and this is Africa over here, and we're seeing a really rapid growth in the urban population. So worldwide, we've seen just in 1950, there was 751 million people, and last year there was 4.2 billion people living in urban areas. But what about Africa? We're seeing the fastest rates of urbanization worldwide. So we only had 15% of our population in 1950 living in urban areas. And today we're seeing we have 43%. That's quite substantive. A lot of this is happening, especially post-independence of our countries. And 59% of our population now lives in informal settlements, it's estimated. And this, of course, these figures are all estimations, are expected to either double or triple up to 2050. So if we think about the proportion of people living and where they're moving to, in Asia, for example, we're seeing only 1.1% increase in urban populations per annum. In Namibia, my home country, we're seeing 3.4% moving to urban centers in formal areas. But we're seeing 7.2% people the growth every year is happening in these peri-urban areas. And just in my lifetime, since I started my PhD, there's been a doubling of peri-urban areas in my home country. So this is why authors such as I recommend this book called Planet of the Slums by Mike Davis. There's a lot of criticism of it, but it's also very interesting to really raise the issue of the growth of these areas. So finally, the final component is Africa has an extraordinary richness and it's a strategic asset. So the International Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services raised that we have huge economic ecosystem service valuation opportunities. And it's estimated that in rural areas, we have 62% of the population that's dependent on these ecosystem services, but we don't know what this is in urban areas. And there's many, but nevertheless, we only have 14% of our continent is covered in protection. So how do we deal with conservation beyond these protected areas in light of the rapid decline of species across the continent in the 5 major taxonomic growths and the huge extinction rates that we've seen in the last 500 years? We don't have the information about this. If you look at the major regions across the continent and the ecosystem service valuations that have been done, we only have 337 studies that have been done. And most of this is in East Africa and Southern Africa. And if we compare this to other systematic reviews that have been involved in the last few years, we see the same. The gray indicates huge deficits in knowledge on ecosystem services and agricultural landscapes, and the relationship between social equity and conservation outcomes. We don't have the data. So green urban infrastructure is a potential silver bullet. So this is an animation that was given to me by a municipal officer in Dar es Salaam, and you'll recognize the Msimbazi River Valley. And the idea is that well-functioning ecosystem services provide a range of ecosystems provide a range of services that can buffer against risks. So under different flood regimes, we can use the landscape for different purposes, such as recreation and urban agriculture. But we know this story is not true. This is the reality. This is the Msimbazi River Valley. And we're seeing solid waste management issues. We're seeing open defecation. We're seeing landslides. We're seeing flash floods. And just on Monday, for example, this news report was released in Namibia, where we're seeing an epidemic outbreak of hepatitis E, and this is similar in many cases across the continent. So my work aims to combine multi-scalar institutional analysis, empirical data collection, and participatory scenario planning to determine the synergies and trade-offs of green urban infrastructure in these peri-urban areas. And we're using a transdisciplinary approach. We're working in Namibia, which is an inland drought-prone area, and Windhoek and Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, which is 10 times the size and a coastal zone. So it represents broader regional coverage and range of population sizes, and it offers strong local partnerships where we have data deficiency. So I won't go into all the issues that we're looking at, but I'll just touch on 4 questions and I'll focus on some results. So we're trying to assess the impacts of water-related green urban infrastructure on ecosystem service supply and well-being. So we'll be running a survey looking at different issues of the benefits and conflicts and trade-offs. We're also trying to understand the impacts of seasonal variability on water access supply, both in rural and peri-urban areas, and how that affects this growth, and what are the autonomous adaptation pathways in response. We've been running a survey in the last few months, and this is an example of, we've reached about 800 households. We've been doing key informant interviews and 4 weeks of field data, looking at different scales of influence and sector types. And we're based on a study that we just published in April this year, looking at ecosystem-based risk reduction. In mountain systems, we're trying to look at the institutional, cultural, regulatory, behavioral barriers to this implement, why these solutions are not being mainstreamed. And we're using scenario analysis, which is a method that was developed in East Africa called Kesho, meaning tomorrow, to envision futures. So we ask what key factors influence resilience up to 2030 and 2063 in line with the SDGs and the AU agenda, and what are the trade-offs between alternatives across space and time. We use normative scenario planning, which allows us to look at the future and what steps could bring us back from that future rather than thinking about exploratory scenarios. So when we try to think about what climate proofing the nexus in green urban infrastructure means, For example, if we look at water, we might think about how do we implement these boreholes, how do we allow for better groundwater recharge. But green urban infrastructure would involve indigenous reforestation, rehabilitation, and we'd need to use soft infrastructure such as water marshals. We can see, I'll just go through a few more slides. we see when we look at normalized vegetation index that there's major differences between social wealth, and around the periphery we're seeing substantive breakdown, shrubland loss. There's major potential for innovation in terms of prioritizing longer-term disaster intervention, building ownership and a sense of place for these people living in these areas, promoting the fact that we need more communal versus individual deeds in these areas. We need to clarify tenure agreements. We need more conservation organizations work in the urban areas. We need to support in-situ upgrading, including climate proofing in these processes. We need better zoning. We need to really upscale strategic environmental impact assessments. We need to drive down the cost of transformation by accounting for more ecosystem services in the informal economy assessments. We need to promote corporate social responsibility that can preempt these risks. And we need to recognize the politicization of information in decision-making processes. And finally, there are many technical needs that we can support development. So I'd like to say thank you very much to all my partners.